Hey everyone, this is Zephyr with the Foundry Basics tutorial on getting started with Foundry. In this tutorial, we're going to go over configuring your Foundry setup, installing your first system, creating a world, adding users and players for that world, then creating actors such as your player characters, NPCs, and monsters, assigning permissions for those characters, creating scenes, walling those scenes, and running an actual combat encounter within those scenes. We'll also go over how to use dice rolls, items, and attacks, and everything you need to get started with your first session. We won't be covering installation with your license activation, port forwarding, or voice and video communication directly through Foundry. We'll get everything else for you to run your first game. First off, after you've activated your license, this is what your Foundry setup screen will look like. Within it, we have several tabs, and this first tab is your game systems area. There's some getting started information, and you'll notice that Game Worlds is grayed out because you must have a game system installed before you can create a world. You can use the simple world building system that Foundry recommends, or you can select the Install System option to find another system of your choice. For this tutorial, we're going to be using D&D 5e as it is one of the most popular systems on Foundry. An important vocabulary note about systems when we're talking about Foundry is that when we say system, we usually mean the RPG gaming system such as Simple World Building, D&D 5e, Pathfinder, The Dark Eye, etc., rather than your system's operating system of Windows, Mac, or Linux. When we open up the Install System menu, we can scroll through manually or search for the system that we want, in this case, D&D 5e. Once you've selected your system, click the Install option to have it install, and we'll see this blue progress bar downloading and installing the system. And you'll get a pop-up at the top of the screen indicating that it was installed successfully, with the system being added to the list here. You can pick any number of these other systems if you want to install them, but we're going to continue with just the 5e system here first. We'll notice now that Game Worlds is no longer grayed out, so we can actually create a world. We'll tackle that later. Add-on modules is where you can add additional modules for content, such as the Baileywiki maps, etc., or technical features such as Scene Packer and levels. We're not going to cover any modules today, but we will discuss a few that you might want to consider picking up as we progress through this tutorial. Next, the most important thing you should do when you first set up Foundry is to go into your configurations, and in here there are a lot of options, and all of these will require you to restart your Foundry installation. The first thing you should do is set up an administrator password. This is going to prevent people from being able to just go to your setup and deleting your worlds or your game systems, etc. So it's very important to set this up first, even if you don't intend on port forwarding and connecting this specific instance to the internet. There are other options here, such as changing your default language or default world, and other networking options that we'll cover in another video. Once you have configured this to your liking, you'll select Save Changes, and you're going to be forced to restart Foundry. Selecting Save Changes will give you a pop-up confirming that. Once you select Yes, it's going to shut down Foundry. Coming back now after I've restarted, I'm going to have to use that new password I established. A final note before we create our first world is the Update Software tab. This is where if there is a new version of Foundry available, you will be able to check for the update. You can see the current version and the different channels. Stable is what I would recommend most people stay on, but you can read more about those later. And this check for update button is what will let you know if you can install a new one. Going to our Game Worlds tab, we can now install a world, which is where we can install a pre-configured world that has its own defined system ready for us to go out of the box. Or we can create our own world, and this is what most users will probably want to do first. Selecting Create a World is going to give us a dialog box where we're going to put in the world title, which is just kind of the display name for the world. and then we can specify a data path. Note that it will automatically force lowercase and add hyphens where spaces are. So you don't normally need to change this, but if you want a specific data path, you're free to do so. Next, we want to set up our game system, and we can see the D&D 5e system that we have. We can also optionally specify a background image and next session and world description. These are important if your group wants to have the sessions clearly displayed on the Foundry page, or if you have a specific background image and description that you want. If you're not going to be taking use of these, you can safely ignore them. They're completely optional. After we've created the world, we can see the version up here that it was created on. And we also have the option to reset user passwords and go back and change any of the information we specified already, except for the game system. And we can also launch this in a safe configuration if we don't want to launch it with modules in the future. If, for example, we install some modules that have conflicts either amongst each other or with the latest version of Foundry. Now that we're done reviewing and editing the world, it's time to launch it. This is the login screen that you and your players are going to see every time they go to join your world or your game. From the drop-down on Select User, select Game Master. Notice that the current players say 0 out of 1 because no one is logged in and there's only one user configured for this world right now, and that's you, the Game Master. When you first log in, there are some info cards in the chat here about getting started and inviting your players. I encourage you to take a look at those in detail when you first set up. But we're first going to head to User Management. And this is where we are again going to set our password as the Game Master first and foremost so that no one can just log in as the Game Master and change these settings. Then we're going to create our additional players. And you'll notice that we can change the user role from player to trusted player, assistant game master, and game master, and we can assign them initial passwords. And when I use passwords, I usually do something basic, and then players are then able to change the passwords on their own later. So it's up to you how you want to handle that. In terms of the user roles, that is also up to you as to how much power you want to give them. We'll go more in depth later about this, but when we go into the permissions configuration, this is the difference between player, trusted player, assistant GM, and GM. So you want to take a look at this if there's anything in specific that you want to edit. For most use cases, you don't really need to change it, and most of your players can be set as just player. But if there's extra features you want to give them, keep that in mind. We're going to log back into our world now as the Game Master. We can see down here is the administrator password we would use to return to our setup. And since we specified that, we can't just go directly back to the setup without the password. So another point where it's really important to actually have that security in place. Now we're going to join our game session with a password this time. And again, going back here to user management, you can edit these further if you need, and we'll log back in. Now that we're back into Foundry, let's tour some of the features of Foundry. This right-hand area is your Directories bar, and we'll use that term throughout this tutorial. First, have the chat log, then we have the combat tracker, which is currently empty. Our scenes directory, this is where your maps will live. Actors, where things like NPCs, player characters, items, journals, role tables, card stacks, music, and then our compendiums directory. Then finally, we have back to our settings, which we had already visited previously. So those are all of our directories. Whenever we say directory, we'll bring that up again. And these compendiums are important to know because that's where you get extra content. On the left, we have our tools, and that's where we'll use the term actors tool versus actors directory. And same thing with scenes. You'll notice that the tools are grayed out. So we're first going to go to our scenes directory and create a new scene. I'm just going to call it blank, and there are some default configurations, and we'll save those changes and leave that there. You can see our Foundry Basics video on scenes for detailed descriptions of all of these settings, but we're going to leave this with just the overview right now. Up here, you'll notice that there is a target next to blank. That is indicating the currently active scene, the scene that everyone is looking at, everyone can see the name of, and then we see this little pip with an orange G for Game Master. That's indicating what players are actively viewing this particular scene. Normally, it's probably going to have all of your players looking at the same scene, but that might not always be true. You can see now our tools are open. We have tokens, measurements, tiles, drawings, walls, lighting, ambient sounds, and map notes. We'll be going through all of these a little bit individually, but we're not going to get into the details of all of them. See the appropriate Foundry Basics videos for in-depth explanations on each of these tools and each of the different aspects of Foundry that these cover. For the quick overview, the actors or token controls are where you can select things. You don't have a token right now, so we'll hold off on that. Measurement is where we can add in these templates, like for spells or areas of effect, etc. And we have circular, conical, square, and ray-shaped templates that we can add in. And we'll notice that the squares get filled in with what would be affected by those templates. We can't select these, so we just hover over them and then delete them. Next, we have our tiles controls, and this is where you can add in kind of floating artwork from different aspects and have those incorporated into your scene in addition to the background image that we will set in a moment. And there's a lot of different places to grab these images from, whether that's the Foundry core data, which are things that are included with Foundry, or your systems. You can drag those in and change their size by updating the asset grid size. Again, see our Foundry Basics video on tiles for an in-depth explanation and exploration of all things tiles in Foundry. Next, we have our drawings, which have a variety of simple shapes that you can draw, and these can be used for keeping your own notes or communicating with your players. We can adjust different aspects, such as the line and the fill. And I'm actually going to use this gear tool, and this is where I can configure the default settings for things. So now that I've configured that default, we can see that it pops back up with the line width and styles. So we're able to maintain that same line width and have a baseline. And these are a lot easier to see. So have a polygonal tool where we're using just straight edges and double clicking to finish our designs, and a free draw that functions more like a pencil on canvas. And finally, a text tool where there is already supplied text, and we can update the font size of that as well, and change the font style too. There's a lot of options with drawings. We're not going to get into the weeds of that today, but I just wanted to show these to you so that you know that they're there and that you can use them for making your notes, etc. Next, we have our walls, and that's what's going to limit sounds, lighting, and movement for our different characters. We can see a little bit of the information about what they can and cannot block, and some styles there. Again, we have a Foundry Basics video on walls, so check that out if you want a detailed explanation of those. Next, we have lighting, and lighting has a lot of different aspects to it. There are basic and advanced configurations with animations, etc. And that is how we are going to create light and atmosphere on our scenes and influence the vision of our tokens. There are also buttons for setting the scene lighting from daylight to darkness, and that is going to darken or brighten the entire scene. It's worth noting that this does not necessarily incur the bright or dim lighting conditions on your characters. You'll have to manually configure that through other means. Also important is the reset fog option, which will hide the fog of war for people. Finally, we have ambient sounds, where we are going to go through and be able to draw sound areas and have playable sounds. If we have these earmuffs on, we're able to preview sounds, and if we have them disabled, then we will not hear them. That's giving you a little bit of a preview. Ordinarily, you'd have to have a token in there. Then we have the map notes. These are basically just allowing you to see map notes from journal entries plugged in. We're not going to go over that at all today, so see our Foundry Basics on that. Now that we've got a scene, let's create some actors. So in our actors directory, we can either create an actor or create a folder. Let's start off with a folder. And we can name this folder whatever we want, just something descriptive. Then we can edit the folder and do other things such as configure a color to it, like a dark green for our player characters. And then within that folder itself, we are also able to do further actions. Let's make one more folder for monsters. You can see that we can specify that color from the creation standpoint without having to go into edit. Next, when we click a plus on the person icon, we will create an actor within that folder. So it's already contained inside of the player characters. And so here I've made one and named it Zephyr, and this is going to be our example 5e character that we do. The first thing that we're going to do is add some artwork. In your user data folder, this is where you're most going to want to add your artwork. In modules, that is where you'll have data from the different add-on modules that you install. You probably don't want to put data in there if you are going to have that module updated, because it will overwrite anything you have. Same thing with the systems, though you may want to use some of the artwork that is included in a system or module. I just wouldn't put your own images in there. Finally, we have worlds, and this is tied to world per world. And if you delete this world, then you will also delete everything you put inside of it. So while you're totally free to do that, if you believe you might use this artwork or these files in other worlds, I would suggest adding a larger overarching folder, such as images, like I'm going to do here. And then get as organized or disorganized as you want. I find it helpful to have a series of different directories and file names for keeping these things straight, but it's completely up to your personal preference on how detailed and organized you want to be on these and what your own personal organizational scheme is. Once I've done that, I'm going to select Choose File, and this is going to open up to an area on my computer where I can then select the file I want to use. This is not something that has to be on your local Foundry instance. It is going to open up the file browser on your personal machine that you're connected to Foundry on. So even if you're doing this on a server, you will have this experience where you will upload a file from your personal files. I've already got an image here from Ivana Abat off ArtStation that I'm just using for example purposes here. And now that I've selected my artwork, I am going to begin editing my character sheet. I can physically just type in the new values for these things. So I have my character sheet open in another screen while I'm doing this, and this is how I would recommend you do it. You can also leave this up to your players to do and have them configure their own sheets. And we can see I can toggle my proficiencies and skills by clicking on them. We first go proficient, then half proficiency, then expertise, and finally back to not proficient. So I am setting up the different proficiencies that this character has, and that is all ready to go. Next, I can go through all of these other different senses and specific attribute information here. We'll notice that our proficiency is just a +1, and we're level 0 right now because we don't have a class. But we'll go ahead and take care of senses, such as setting our dark vision up as we are a tiefling here. Languages, we can select from the dropdowns. These are provided by the 5e system. And if there's any custom ones we want in here, we can also add them in at the bottom and separate additional ones with a semicolon. So for proficient in Pig Latin, we can add that here, and we'll see that it populates like a button, like all the others. We can do the same thing with damage immunities, resistances, and vulnerabilities. And similarly with weapon proficiencies and armor proficiencies, etc. You'll see I move over to my second monitor to double check my sheets at times. And so this character is proficient in simple weapons, and again, just to show that you can add these special additional ones, they're also proficient with the Meteor Hammer, because why not? We do the same thing with armor. So this is a great way if you have any unique ones or highly specific options that you can add that in. And finally, this character is proficient with the lute, and we'll go ahead and add them proficiency with a cello for music performance purposes. Finally, we have special traits, and these are ones that actually have mechanical advantages within the 5e system. So they correspond to certain feats or global bonuses. For example, if you have something that just gives you +1 to melee weapon attacks all of the time, that will handle that. Then we have our inventory, and we're going to use these compendiums here. And all the ones marked by SRD at the end of them are from the 5e system. And this is basically the base rules where they have included all of these pre-configured items, etc. So you're going to have items and spells, assuming this is a spellcaster. Then you'll also want racial features, class, and class features open. And we're just going to be dragging these items directly onto our character sheet to build them out with the proper abilities and information. So laying that out so that you can see easily. Classes we're going to use the least, so I'm going to have that kind of underneath the class features. In order to add these different items, we'll just go to our features, and here's where we can add in like our racial features for being a tiefling. If you click on it, then you'll expand the description, and you'll also see that it mentions some of the other aspects. I've already included the attribute increases conferred by being a tiefling. Note that it does not automatically increase on the Foundry sheet, so just keep that in mind. Then I'll want to go through and add my Hellish Resistance and Dark One's Blessing, or rather Infernal Legacy here for this character's racial abilities. Then this character is going to be a Tiefling Warlock, and it will ask if we want to apply the other features of a level 1 Warlock. So we've specified that they are a Warlock, and unfortunately we don't have anything for the subclasses, so we'll have to keep track of that kind of separately. And to do that, we'll just edit these other aspects to name the subclass and have that covered. So you may have to do some editing if you're using just SRD content. Note that there are a lot of different modules for importing additional content, so you don't have to just do these manual configurations and additions on some of these pieces, but this is a good way to get started, particularly if you're using level 1 characters and you have most of the bones already. Now that we've added in these other features, I'll show you how to handle other aspects like inventory and spells. Once we have inventory and spells covered, I am going to finish building this character out, and I will speed it up significantly so that we don't need to spend all the time going through this. But we'll start off with spells, and just like these other aspects, we can just drag things like Thaumaturgy in and our Eldritch Blast. I'll be going through the character sheet in more detail and grabbing all of our spells. And then we can go to inventory and bring in our items. After consulting my book over here, I will know what I need to bring in, and that's going to be some leather armor and some different simple weapons. You can scroll through these compendiums, or you can search like I'm doing here, whatever is easiest for you. Again, these are all going to be within the basic rules. If you have things that are from just the player's handbook or from something like Tasha's Cauldron of Everything, you'll need to input those yourself. You can also import things and then edit them afterwards, or duplicate things and make variants. You can also see our currency up here at the top for any editing. And we're basically just going to be repeating this process for the entirety of the sheet and all of our different attributes. Again, we'll see that all of these extra bits are not automatically calculated with base Foundry. There are many modules that will automate that, such as MIDI QOL, Dynamic Active Effects, etc. And we'll also see that our proficiency bonus has gone up from having that character. If you want more automation like that, there's a variety of modules. They're just beyond the scope here. Another important note is we want to equip things if we're going to be using them. That's more important with automation suites, such as MIDI QOL, where you'll have to have something equipped for things to automatically proc. But I'm going to speed up now and finish assembling this character with their inventory and their spells. And one thing I also want to point out as we're doing this, that the tab that you are dragging these things in on can matter. Here in just a moment, I'm going to import a spell while I'm on the inventory tab. And you'll see that when I drag it in on the inventory tab, it's actually going to appear as a spell scroll rather than a spell. So keep an eye on that. That's also good to know if you want to give players spell scrolls. You don't need to make a separate item. Just drag it in like it's a spell to the inventory rather than the spell book. Once everything is dragged in and I have all of the features included, then we're ready to go. And this character is complete. This didn't take too long since I already have my character sheet made. And again, you can have your players configure this themselves, either from looking at the compendiums or through items. Here, it kind of worked out that the default of 10 HP is exactly what I needed, but you can edit that as well as setting up temp HP and max HP. Then, as I mentioned before, in addition to importing from your compendiums, you can also import directly from your items areas. What's also important to note about the equipped is for armor, etc., it is going to automatically add to the armor class. So you'll see if I unequip the leather armor, it goes down to 11, and re-equip it, it goes back up to 12. I have the weapons equipped, but again, that's kind of more important for automation suites as opposed to the base functionality of Foundry and the 5e system. But you want to keep that in mind as you add in additional modules, etc. In our spellbook, we have all of the individual entries, and this is a pretty standard here, level 1 Pact of the Fiend Warlock. We have the biography section of the character sheet, where we can add in additional detail. It's simple text editing of writing in what the different pieces are, and you have a WYSIWYG editor for the area that is your backstory. This could also be used as a journal if a player so desired. Again, returning to the attributes, we have the XP. Every other aspect of the sheet is ready to go right here. And like I mentioned previously, you can drag things in directly from the items compendium, or items directory rather. So rather than just using the compendium, I can import that to my items area and drag that into my character's inventory. Boom, there we go. Now that is the same as the item here. That's useful to know if you are making any kind of changes to compendium items, or if for whatever reason you don't want your players to have access to the compendiums and you only want them to have access to the items directory. If you're going to do that, I do advise that you set up subfolders to keep things straight for yourself. You don't want your class features getting mixed up with your item features. And that way you're not going to be dragging the wrong things to the wrong parts of the character sheet. The last thing to do on a new character is to configure the token. Here we want to decide whether we're displaying the name, and generally speaking, I like to personally have it when it's hovered by anyone because the name of a player character is not that strange, but we don't necessarily want it being displayed all the time. Appearance is just the image, so if you wanted to use a different artwork than the token, or than the portrait rather, for the token, you absolutely could. We determine the vision, and then we set this to 60 on dim. Dim vision in Foundry kind of corresponds to dark vision in 5e, whereas bright vision is more corresponding to true sight or devil sight, where you are seeing as if it is bright light for 60 feet, rather than seeing as if it is dim light for 60 feet. Lighting, if someone has a torch or a magical feature, you can configure that. And then resources are things like your health. And similarly, you can determine when that is displayed, either always, always only for the owner, or always for everyone. Then we have the assign and update token buttons. Update is we want to select when we have manually configured it in that setting. But now that we have this token out, we can move them around in various ways. And we can see there's kind of an edge where the vision ends on this, even though there's unrestricted sight on here. Then just to show you the update token, or assign token functionality, I'm going to make a quick change, like scaling down the image on this particular token. So now that I've done that, clicking on this token is a different sheet than the original one. It does not say prototype token. When we bring up the original sheet, we have the assign token option. That's going to set the token to whatever token I have selected. So that's important to keep track of. Now we'll see that the prototype token now looks exactly the same as the one we just assigned. In terms of movement, you can move tokens around in Foundry using WASD and the arrow keys. You can also do diagonal movement by pressing things like up and down at the same time or left and right. We can then click and drag, and we can hold control click to have this kind of measurement, and we can left click along the way to set up waypoints and use space to move along those waypoints. Now let's take a look at monsters. For monsters, we can again go to our compendiums, and in the monsters SRD, this is going to be everything from the base rules. Notice that some of these don't have artwork. While all of their stat blocks are in, Forgotten Adventures makes the artwork for the 5e system here. So those will get updated from this placeholder image to the appropriate token as Forgotten Adventures finishes those. And again, double clicking on any of these, you'll see all of the information. They're already pre-configured, all of the stats you need. So we're going to scroll through here and pick some enemies that we're going to fight later. I'm ultimately going to go ahead and decide on some cultists. I always think it's just classic for my parties to fight some kind of cult as we go. So if I drag directly in from the compendium, I'll have the token in place, and that token will show up in my actors directory as well. If I drag in another one though, it creates an additional entry. We generally want to avoid that, as the more items you have in your directories, whether it be your actors directory, scenes directory, or items directory, the more it's going to tax your performance. So for these tokens that are not linked, it is best to have only one entry for your monsters, etc., so that they are taking up less space. And you'll notice that when I adjust that particular cultist and set its HP to 4, it's not affecting the others. And here, because this is linked actor data, one effect to one token is affecting all of them for these player characters. So that is the difference between these generic monsters and player characters or main NPC characters, where all of their tokens are affected. So if it's not something that's going to have persistent life in your world, where that one entity needs to be edited all the time, then you want to keep it to a single token. Now that we've got all these in place, that is going to finish our group, and we're going to delete them, and we're going to take a look at how I brought in that other hero we saw earlier. The 5e system includes starter heroes, which are several pre-configured level 1 characters for you to start with. This is a great option if you're doing a one-shot introducing people to either Foundry or D&D. And you can import these, and they are completely finished, fleshed out characters. Exact same process that I went through earlier, just already taken care of for you. You can also use this as a baseline for you so that you can just make small edits to this and then create your player's characters. It's completely up to you on how you want to handle them, but you have this option available to you. It's also great if you need generic NPCs that might hang around for a while, either as characters in a town or temporary co-adventurers. I brought in more player characters here just for demonstration purposes, and now we're going to set up the permissions. Here we just have two players set up, player 2 and player 3. And I'm going to set player 2 as the owner of the Zephyr character, and then I can define player 3 as either none, limited, observer, default, or also an owner on this. Default is going to be whatever the all players up at the top says. So when I save changes, that has taken place on the Zephyr character. The permissions are important for being able to access character sheets. So an owner is someone who can edit a character sheet or edit an object in Foundry. A limited option can see some information about them, but not all of it. An observer can see all of the information, but not make changes. We can also propagate permissions through an entire folder. It's important to note that it won't affect subfolders like this familiars folder I brought in. If I set it to limited or observer, then that means when I look on any of these player characters, it's going to say that all players are observers, and then everything that has default follows that convention. Here, I want to make player 3 the owner of Zana. And then with the familiars, again, that folder doesn't inherit permission changes from the overarching folder. So we'll want to configure that. And I am going to make the familiars also observer for my players so they can all look at this owl Tea's sheet. And then we're going to make player 3 the owner of Tea, as they are also the owner of Zana. And then just to show you the difference between observer and limited, I am going to set up Randall here as limited, and we'll take a look on the player side. From this point on, as I have player perspectives, I'm going to have them in the top left so that you can keep track of who's who. We've just logged in as player 2 now. You'll see that when we first log in, we're going to select what's our character. Who are we playing? And so I'm going to select Zephyr, although there are other options here. I'm going to select Zephyr. Who I choose here is what my default character is, and it's going to control what token I immediately go to, but it does not affect my permissions. Also see that there's now a blue P on that navigation. And when we click on these, we can see that Akra we can look at, Zana we can look at, and our character we can actually change and alter our proficiencies if we want. But Randall, we only see this kind of biography tab at the very end of his sheet. And again, we can't actually edit anything on here. So then we also notice that we have absolutely nothing going on the scene right here. It's completely black and the game is paused. And the reason being, right now, I don't have a character on here that player 2 has control over. So we want to make sure that on this blank scene, we have the token. So hopping back over to my Game Master, I'm going to drag back on the Zephyr character. And then we're going to go back to the player perspective, and we'll notice now that we are there, but we can't move around because the game is currently paused, as indicated by the spinning clock down at the bottom. So if we hop back over as GM, we can unpause the game. I hit spacebar to unpause it and repause it. We also go into our configure controls, where we can change that key binding. It's towards the bottom here, and you can see there's a variety of different controls you can alter. But if you want to change this from space to something else, you can do that here. So with that done, we'll unpause and hop back to player 2. And we're able to move about freely on the screen. You also notice that as a player, I only have access to 3 different banks of tools. I have my token tools where I can still do my measurement and my selection and targeting. My measurement tools where I can add my templates for rays, cones, and circles, etc. And I can toggle my journal entries on and off on the map. But I don't have access to all of the GM tools. Note that you can add additional permissions to give them more tools available. We'll cover that here in a moment. Going back to Game Master, you'll also see that there is a little dot where the player 2's mouse is at. On the player 2 perspective, you would also see the Game Master's mouse if it was in there. If you want to change that, you can go to your user management and configure permissions. And this is where we were at earlier, which allows us to add additional features such as creating map notes or journal entries, etc. And what we want to mess with for the mouse cursor is right here, display mouse cursor. You can choose whether anyone is going to have a visible mouse cursor. It might be useful to only have your Game Master or Assistant GM have that visible, etc. There's a variety of settings in here that you might want to have. You notice that the trusted player starts with more default permissions than a regular player. So keep that in mind if you want to gatekeep certain features to only certain players based upon what their character actually uses. I accidentally click on Return to Setup here instead of logging in as the GM. We pop back, and now we will notice that there is no longer a player 2 even logged in because we closed Foundry for that. I went back and logged back in, but we'll notice that the mouse is gone now because we have eliminated that. Now we're going to go ahead and take a look at player 3. So player 3 is a wizard with a familiar. We've dragged them on there, and now we're going to log out of player 2 and log in as player 3. Over player 3, we can move around just fine. We can still see the Game Master mouse down there at the bottom because the Game Master still has display mouse cursor. But we want to bring in our familiar, Tia. Notice that we can click and try and drag all we want, but nothing is coming out. And that is because we don't have the permission to create tokens. So shifting back to Game Master once again, we're going to visit our user configuration one more time. And here is where you'd want to set up if the trusted player, which is what player 3 is, can create new tokens. Create new actors is allowing them to create a whole new actor, like a whole new character. Tokens isn't going to let them create a new actor, but it will let them put the token for the actor into play. And that's what we want to do here for this familiar. It's up to you whether you actually want your players to have this ability, or if you want to personally manage when they drag their familiars or summoned creatures onto the field. It's also worth keeping in mind that this controls the summoning of tokens in general. So if you have another module that automates the summoning of something or the appearance of a token, then your players might need to have this permission enabled, as with automated evocations or similar modules. All right, now that we are back on Game Master, we will go ahead and have everything unpaused, and we see that player 3 needs to log back in. Now that we're logged back in, and we have that update permission, we can drag in Tia right here. And Tia can move around just like any other character and is her own bird in many senses. We can update the different aspects of the token. And this was created just by bringing in, I searched up an owl, obviously as a GM where I could actually bring this in. And I brought in the owl and just duplicated it and made it a new name and gave it a friendly permission. And this is where I realized that I'm logged in as player 3 still. But as a GM, I brought in an owl and renamed it to Tia and set that up initially. So very simple process. You could also create a brand new one like we did with the characters earlier. It's all up to you. With our characters all set up and imported, it's time to make a map that we can actually have a combat encounter for. So you go to my scenes directory, and just like our actors directory, we can create folders, and I'm going to make one for battle maps. I'm choosing to give it a blue color, but it's completely up to you on if you want to use color coding for organization or a different system. I just want to show you what's possible. We're going to name the scene Cult Hideout, and then we're going to select a background image. I've already grabbed one from the Baileywiki Maps Premium Modules module, and I am going to be creating a directory name in my images for maps. And just using choose file, once again, I'm going to find the map image I want to use on my computer, select that, and it will add it to my Foundry data, where I can choose the file and save my changes. I'm going to get a prompt about changing scene dimensions because it's going to automatically adjust the scene's width and height to match the image that I've selected. So here I have this hideout map that has a cult theme. I'm going to configure this further, and we'll notice that our grid size is 100 pixels, but our image dimensions are 5100 by 5100. I know that this image is in a 150 density of pixels per inch, so I'm going to change it down to 3400 by 3400, giving me a total map size of 34 grid units by 34 grid units. So just know the DPI of your map when you go to do this. And now I can also adjust the grid and change the color of the grid lines or the opacity of them to fit whatever I want for my games. Some groups you might not want to use as defined of a grid, and others you might want a very defined grid. Now I'm going to start walling using my wall tool. The triple lines at the top are for normal walls, quote unquote, and those are going to block movement, light, sight, sound, and consequently vision for my players. So you can think of those as just your normal bounding box walls. You'd use them for any time you'd have a wall in real life. Holding down Control, I'm able to continue dragging points. And sometimes if you draw lots of segments, it might stop connecting. So you just need to draw a new wall and delete it. And then you can resume with your Control clicking to continue moving them through. As I move along here, I am going to draw a regular wall over the door. And we'll see how that can be strategic for later to make things easier on you when it comes to putting in your doors. And to demonstrate multiple options for creating doors, I'm going to delete that one. See, when I double click, I can open up the wall settings and I can just change the is door part to true, and it's a closed door. You can also use the door tool to draw in a door directly. Now I'm going to add in terrain walls. Terrain walls have what's called limited obstruction of vision and sound. How limited walls work is that when something connects with one limited wall, it passes through normally. But once it hits a second limited wall, it is as if it is hitting a normal wall. It obstructs it from that point. So this allows players to see the width and art of the pillar, but then they won't be able to see beyond it. And we'll see a demonstration of that here shortly when we test it. I'm using invisible walls, which you could use for windows in a more traditional structure map, or you can use it for things like this altar that is going to obstruct movement, but it's not going to obstruct vision, lighting, or sound. I'm going to do the same thing for this bookcase. You could easily use terrain walls for that as well. Now that we have our walls in, I'm going to go ahead and do some lighting. The lighting tool has a lot of options and a lot of complexity to it, so you can really get into the weeds of this. I'm going to stick with a pretty simple setup here and set a light color. You can see I can adjust the intensity, which is kind of like the saturation here on the color, and I can find something that I like and further tweak the colors. There's also tabs for animations and advanced options, and we can adjust the radii for the dim lighting and the bright lighting as we see fit here. So there's a lot of options, and you can definitely play around. With these animations, we've got things like the torch, and we also have pulse, which is what I'm ultimately going to stick with here, just to show you how the animations work. If you up the speed, it's obviously going to happen faster with this pulsing in and out, and the intensity is going to make the color presence and absence more pronounced. In advanced options, we can go through different coloration techniques, such as making it only affect the area that's outside of the bright light, but within the dim light area. We do a color burn, where it's going to increase the pigmentation of that particular color throughout the scene. And we can mess with absorption, that's going to change the look based upon how much red or how little red is in a given art asset beneath it. We're just sliders like our background saturation to have that red come through more in the art. And we can do the contrast to make the darks darker and the lights lighter, and the shadows to just up the general darkness. You get all things to play around with, and you can really get into the weeds here. So spend as much or as little time as you want on this, or you can keep it really simple. Don't even adjust the color and just make a couple big light sources to give your players bright and dim lighting in this space. I'm going to speed it up now as I add some additional lighting elements in here. And one thing I want to talk about before we get to it is it's really important when you're done walling and lighting a scene that you bring in a token and you walk through your area so that you can see if there's any weird gaps in your walls, if there's anywhere players can move that they shouldn't be able to, or if there's places where someone should be able to move and they're not able to. So you'll see me do that here in a minute, where I'm going to bring in Randall and walk around a little bit and make sure everything is all good to go. You can see that pillar behavior there. Now that we've fully tested everything with our walls and lights, we're going to go ahead and build out our encounter. To do that, we're going to open up our actors. You'll notice that from actors, if we have things minimized, it becomes a pop-out when we click on it. We can right-click it to open it as well. And now I'm going to drag in my player characters. We're going to use Zana and her owl companion Taya, and we're going to bring in Randall and Zephyr. You can precisely position tokens by holding Control while you have them selected and using your scroll wheel on your mouse to rotate them to have facing. There's a lot of different modules that will also automate or expedite this process for you to look into. And now I'm going to place my enemies. I'm going to give the party a little more breathing room by backing them up. We'll do a nice fair 4v4 between 3 cultists and a cult fanatic versus 3 party members and an owl. Seems reasonable. Once we have all of these entities in place, if you want to run this kind of like at the tabletop where you're just moving minis around, then this is where you can stop. You can roll initiative separately with physical dice, and just move characters around as you need them. And you don't need to use Foundry for anything else other than being minis or maybe keeping track of health as you want. But if you want to take advantage of Foundry's ability to track initiative and use extra attacks, then we can certainly do that. The first phase is going to be selecting all of your combatants, and we'll use a click and drag to make a big selection around everything. Once they're all selected, we can right-click on one of them, and this crossed swords behind a shield is the toggle combat state. Doesn't look like it does anything, but you'll notice there's an orange background around that. And if we go to our combat tracker, see that everyone is now here. This is no longer empty. You can also pop this out by right-clicking it, which might be useful to keep track of initiative during combat. Or you can pop out your chat log. I recommend having both of these open in some combination of pop-outs and part of your directories. From there, then, we can also roll initiative for all of our NPCs or all of our PCs. And we can click on the dice to manually roll. Clicking Roll NPCs is going to roll initiative for everyone who does not have a user-owned character. So Zana, Zephyr, and Taya are all owned by users that we've defined, while Randall is not, so he's treated like an NPC. And Zephyr will just click on the die to roll initiative for him. And then we're going to jump over to player 3's perspective, Zana. And we'll notice here that Zana is still looking at the blank map. And we see that target up next to blank. That's showing that that is still the active scene. So to bring Zana over, we're going to have to activate the cult hideout scene. And again, we see that little pip indicating that player 3 is on the blank scene while we are on cult hideout. So when we activate this and put the little target, see that eventually player 3 pops over here and we get that orange P over on the same scene. So returning to player 3 and Zana, they now have vision of this scene and they are here with us for this combat. And just like on the GM, they have the combat tracker here. There's different options for hiding the names of people, so if you want to keep those combatants secret, you can do so. But we're not going to get into that for this tutorial. And as the player normally would, player 3 is going to roll for Zana and Taya and add themselves to the initiative. And we'll notice that we can go in and look at all these dice rolls, and we can explode the result, so to speak, by clicking on it, and we can see what was rolled on the die and what the modifiers were. Pretty easy math with a d20 and a single number modifier, but if you're looking at, 4d6 or something like that, it can be interesting to see what all of the different die results were. As we hover over the names in the combat tracker, we'll see highlights around the tokens themselves. That's true for both the GM and the player. As a GM, you can also right-click on a combatant and update combatant to change the displayed name, hide them, etc., or alter their initiative. For example, some companions share initiative counts with their owners, or if you have a player that rolls on their own dice tray at home with physical dice, rather than using Foundry, you can update their initiative roll manually this way. Once we have all the initiative taken care of, again, we can hover over the different units and we'll have them highlighted and we can hit begin combat. And it's going to automatically put this nice orange bar around the current turn character. So this Cult Fanatic is going to go first. And this is where combat is a little more involved for a GM than for a player, but it's still significantly easier than with traditional like pencil and paper at the table. So we're going to double click on the Cult Fanatic to bring up its sheet. And then we probably want to have our features open for the most part. We will need to see attributes every now and then, but features is where we're going to see their options for attacking. So this Cult Fanatic has the multi-attack feature where he's going to attack twice and has a dagger available, and we can see what the total modifier is on that. And with this, when we click on the die next to dagger, it's actually going to put in this card in the chat. And within that, we have buttons for attack and damage rolls. So when we select attack, we can choose to make it normal, advantage, or disadvantage, and any situational bonuses such as a Barbarian's Rage. We can also adjust the roll mode, but we'll go into that a little more later. And again, we can explode this die roll, see that they rolled pretty poorly on the die, and a 9 is not going to hit Randall here. So we'll go ahead and take the next attack with the dagger. We don't have to click on it again from the sheet. We can click on that same card again in order to make these attack rolls. And again, we've got a bad roll here. A nat 1 is certainly not going to hit Randall. So with that, that is all that the Cult Fanatic has available to them. So we can safely close their character sheet until we need to do something else with them. We'll now have our first cultist step up to take a swing at Randall with his scimitar. But again, we can see in the features, we can target Randall, but that's mostly a bookkeeping thing for ourselves. So we remember, oh yeah, who was this guy attacking? Oh, it was Randall. And then we'll have that tracked. There are a number of modules that will automate that and actually incorporate targeting for determining hits, damage, etc. But Vanilla Foundry doesn't have that level of automation included. As again, our poor cultists are just swinging and missing on Randall. So we're going to have our third cultist step up and take a crack at our character we assembled earlier, Zephyr. And this time we have a crit. We can tell it's a crit because that number is green, which means the highest value possible on the die was revealed. And a nat 20 or a 23 certainly hit Zephyr's AC. So we're going to now roll the damage. Again, I could have used damage from that card, or I could have clicked it again. And I selected the critical hit option, which is automatically going to roll double the dice and add the modifier once, to hit Zephyr for a whopping 9 points of damage. Not a good day so far for Zephyr. You'll notice also that we can either use -9 to subtract from the 10 hit points, or we can manually set it to 1, etc. So you can use the mathematical operator to deduct or add to health totals, so you can choose how much math you want to do with the table. Now let's go to Zephyr's turn. Zephyr actually has a spell that he can cast as a reaction, and that is Hellish Rebuke right here. So with Hellish Rebuke, again, this is spell casting, and we can see that we have a Pact Magic slot available. So when we click on the die, let's see what happens. We're going to get this little pop-up asking what level of spell we're going to cast it at. If we had multiple levels of spell slots, it would ask, but Warlock Life, it's just a Pact slot, and the toggle for consuming a spell slot is always on. Now I'm going to select this Cultist, and I'm going to do that before I click on anything with the saving throw, because then when I click on it, it's going to use the Cultist's Dex save. We can see that the roll was 1d20 plus 1, and it shows the Cultist name at the top of the tag. And sure enough, the Cultist has a +1 to Dexterity saving throws, saving this with relative ease on an 11 DC Dex check. So they're going to take half damage, which is going to be 7 halved to 3. Pretty rough day for Zephyr here. People saving against his spells, getting crits on him, and not taking a lot of damage here. So now it's going to be Zephyr's actual turn, and he's going to cast Eldritch Blast, but let's say he wanted to cast Burning Hands. You get a big red pop-up saying that you don't have any spell slots left. You're going to have to take a short rest there to get those back. So we are going to go ahead and use that Eldritch Blast. And this time we are going to go ahead and hit and roll for damage, just like we would with the dagger. And that's going to give us a whopping 1. Pretty rough day, but hopefully Zana and Antea have some good turns in there for them, and Randall as well, so that they can make it out of this combat unscathed. We're going to hop now down straight to Zana and Antea here. And with Zana, they are also a spellcaster, so we can look at features and spellbook. Here, I'm going to be a cool DM and say that because the familiar and the wizard have the same initiative count, they can choose which one goes first. So they're going to have Taya actually fly over and give them the help action by harassing this other cultist here. And with that, then they're going to be able to have advantage on their attack roll. So since Zana owns and controls Taya, they're going to be able to grab Taya and then move Taya down either by clicking and dragging, or they could use the arrow keys. And Taya is now messing with this cultist and allowing Zana to get advantage on this cast of Firebolt. That's going to be a cool 22 to hit, which is going to easily surpass the AC of this cultist. And we can see that this is 2d20 KH, or keep highest. You can see the 17 is darkened because that is the higher die roll, and that is what was kept. So we can see that it was 17 plus the modifiers. Now we'll do the damage, and Zon is having a much better day than Zephyr, and is going to absolutely toast this cultist. Now, Zon doesn't know the AC of this cultist and can't control the health, so we're going to have to jump back over to our DM side to now modify the health of this cultist and give them a nice -9, not 89, -9, and bring them down to -5 HP. So that cultist is very much dead. So we're going to mark them as defeated, and we can see this nice plus dead marker on it. So they are now removed from combat effectively and are redded out. So we can see that they are dead, and that is how you will mark everything through, and we can just continue hitting that next button to cycle through turns and handle all of that. Now, as we're going through this, I also want to take a look at the role modes. If we look at the Cult Fanatic, you can see that if I put a private GM role when I click this card is going to be white. And what that means is that if I hop back over to player 3 doesn't see this dagger card that just went into chat for me, the GM. That's because they don't have permission to see GM only chat cards, etc. And Zana can do this as well. Zana can do a private GM role, and what that means is that any other player is not going to see this firebolt that is sent to the Game Master. And we'll see that if we select attack or damage on here, the role mode is going to inherit that of the card. It's going to default to this private GM role. We can manually change it to any of the other options, but it's going to start as the same as the card. So you don't have to micromanage too much if you start the process with the right role type. We also have blind GM roles. And a blind GM role means you're rolling and only the GM sees it. You don't. So you don't have the visibility. This could come into play with a number of things where maybe you're shooting blindly and the GM doesn't want you to necessarily know how well you did, or if you're using the homebrew rule of hidden death saves, where maybe you're blind GM rolling your death save, so you're still the one rolling the die, but the GM is the only one who sees it. You can also privately roll dice, and we can see that the GM themselves can't actually see privately rolled dice. Maybe you're making a wisdom save to see if your character is going to punch someone else who said something inappropriate to them. But any number of reasons why you might use those configurations. And we see there's kind of a loose color coding here too. These white cards, as we're a GM, are the ones that we have made that were GM only. And then if it's in this pinkish color, these are the ones that were blind GM, which means only we can see that. Whereas the ones from Zana are white and they're between the two of us. The self rolls are also white and only that player can see them. In addition to all of these other facets to the role like privacy, we can also roll manually. And for that, we're going to do a /R space, which is going to be roll, and 1d20. Say this is for an environmental effect about this hideout collapsing. Party wants a high roll, so like good luck. But it was low, so maybe there's 3d6, and 11 is how many rocks fall down from the ceiling. So 11 rocks are going to fall down, and after so many have fallen, the place is going to collapse. We can also expand this on, if we're even in the character generation standpoint, we can be working on rolling our stats. So the common stat generation method of 46 drop the lowest, we can phrase as 46 KH 3, or roll 46, keep the highest 3. And if we enter that in, we are going to end up with rolling it, and we can explode out to see the full result. See the grayed out 1 was discarded, and this red 1, which is the lowest possible value on the die, was our third die kept. So, lowest possible value on dice are going to be highlighted in red, whereas the highest possible value is going to be highlighted in green. You'll notice on this 23 crit, the total result is highlighted in green as well. This is because every die that was involved was the highest amount possible. If we had gotten triple ones here on the 46, keep the highest 3, or rather quadruple ones, then we would have seen a red 3 there versus a 11. As we've noticed with these other manual roles or using the cards, we'll see that when we actually execute them, we have the name of whoever sent it there. We can apply this to regular chats as well. So if I say attack while I have this cultist selected, it's going to pan to the token speaker and it's going to pop up a chat bubble saying attack. If I have nothing selected, then it's still going to show Game Master. We'll also see that if I make this a private GM role, or a blind GM role, or a self role, it's not going to actually affect the visibility of chats, only dice rolls. Another thing to notice is that there is a slight highlighting around my Game Master attack one, because that is the color of my player tag. I'm going to open up my user configuration here really quick, which everyone is able to access, and I'm going to make this into red. And I didn't notice it when I first did it, but I managed to accidentally click Taya and claim Taya as the character that I am playing as the Game Master. So when I go back to user configuration, I realize I can release the character and no longer have that character as my primary one. So now when I say something with nothing selected, it is going to pop up as Game Master and in red. And we can see how this applies for player 3 as well. I'm going to open up their user configuration and set the color to this purple to kind of match the robes and make it easier to see their chats as well. And so now with Zana, I'm going to say retreat. And just like with the GM, it's going to pan to this token speaker and it's going to have a chat bubble with retreat and Zana's name up at the top rather than player 3. Notice that even if I have nothing selected though, and I say I'm thinking ... it's still going to come out as Zana. Doesn't matter if I have nothing selected or not as a player. In order to talk out of character as a player, I need to do /OOC, again, out of character. And now when I say I'm thinking ... it's going to pop up in the chat log, but Zana's not going to say anything, and it's going to have my player 3 highlighting. Another chat command is /W for whisper. So you'll do /W space and you'll write the name of the user that you're trying to whisper to. So here I'm whispering to player number 2. And only player number 2 and myself can see that. You're most frequently going to use this between player and Game Master. So here, player 3 is going to say to the Game Master that I want to try to cast this spell. Maybe you're trying to do something secretive, or there is something that you're on a different scene from the rest of the players, and you and the GM are trying to communicate separately from that, etc. And so there's an option. Notice that if I target someone, it does not let me just talk to that player. You do have to write in their username. And going back to the GM view, again, I can only see the message that was sent to me as a GM. I cannot see what was said between player 2 and player 3. So that is the gist of the whispers. Now, let's say that the party pulls a triumphant comeback and manages to wipe out these cultists and not lose anyone. Then we can mark all of these cultists as dead and end the combat. When we end the combat, we'll notice that nothing is in the combat tracker, and right-clicking on any of these tokens, the toggle combat state is still clear. And now I can delete these tokens freely unless I want to leave them around for looting or some other purpose. Another selection tip is you can hold down Shift-click to select multiple items without having to use the drag box and include poor Randall here in the deletion mode. For XP, I can just open up the character sheets of these players and edit this min XP, or current XP value rather, and set to 100. I could also tell my players, hey, you got 100 XP, and just honor system that they'll put in the correct amount on their character sheets. Now I also want to show you that battle maps are not the only types of scenes and maps you can use in Foundry. This library scene is a copy of the bookshelf from the Baileywiki Premium Maps module, and Baileywiki and Param King put this together for a great video talking about interactive elements in Foundry VTT. That is kind of the essence of what these Theater of Mind scenes are about. This doesn't necessarily have to be interactive, but it's something where you're not necessarily using minis. And I've assembled this with the scene background and tiles.
Check out the Foundry Basics episode on tiles if you want to know more about using that. But we have this great library scene for showing off a way to have things where movement isn't necessarily central, where you're going to be just talking around the table. But we have a problem. When we activate this scene and have player 2 come on here, they can't see anything. We have no tokens on here, so they have no vision. Because of the initial view position, they start in the padded area of the scene, so they're still able to look around, but they're not able to see the scene itself here. So to fix that, we're going to have to make a few adjustments to the scene. I'm going to right-click on the library and configure it. These first few are going to be cosmetic and personal taste, where I want to darken the background color to black to make it a little more atmospheric. Not necessary, but something that I want to do. And then I am also going to adjust my grid. I can change the size. I know that these assets work better with 256 grid size rather than 150, or 100 rather. And then I don't really like the lines from the grid. They're pretty subtle here, but I don't want them at all. I can go gridless and completely hide them. But with gridless, you have some interesting complications with moving things around, like the tiles. So I'm going to make it square and set the grid opacity to 0. So visually, this is where I want it to be. But now, for the really important aspect of these theater of mind scenes, we're going to turn off token vision and fog exploration. In theory, fog exploration is unnecessary to turn off here, but token vision is really important. It is what restricts it so that only if you have a token there. So if you have token vision off, then anyone who has been on the scene either via activation or navigation can see all the contents of the scene. So now switching back to player 2, I can now see the entirety of this scene. I can see all of these beautiful books that have been placed, and I have full access to all the visual aspects of the scene. So it's perfectly set up for having a theater of mind scene, like a shopping scene, or talking to an NPC here in the library. And if I need to make a roll like my history check, I open up my actors directory and open up my character sheet, and then I just click history, and I'll go ahead and roll my history check. I might want to change that from self-roll to public or a GM roll when I do that, but I can make all of my checks from my character sheet right there. It does not matter that I don't have a token in the scene. So as you can see, these theater of mind maps are still very powerful in Foundry and allow you to do a lot of different things. We don't have to have everything be a battle map, although obviously Foundry VTT handles battle maps and immersive ones at that incredibly well. That is not all that this virtual tabletop is capable of. And you shouldn't feel like you have to map out every single bit of your campaign just because a virtual tabletop is good at handling battle maps. So this is a quick little demonstration of what you can do with Theater of Mind. Use your own background art, make quick ones, etc. And just have a lot of great options for your campaign. If you want to add some additional features here, a really simple one that I like to do, especially if I'm using something like Token Action HUD or Argon, is to go ahead and drag in my player characters on my Theater of Mind scenes. And this especially helps if you have large grid sizes to make their portraits easily visible. Then I just wall in their tokens in little 1x1 cells so that they can't move, but nothing is obstructed about their vision, and they can just double-click on their portraits to have easy access to their character sheets. Or again, if you're using a module like Argon Combat HUD or Token Action HUD, they'll have buttons up in that top left area to click on for their roles. You can also use this to display artwork for your NPCs, so like you can have a portrait version of your NPC tokens that is easily visible and shows their face without you having to make a pop-up visible to everyone or sending it in a separate channel. So you probably want to use a bigger icon than I did for this librarian here as a proof of concept, but that is an option to you. Okay, this now concludes this episode of Foundry Basics, where we covered everything from your very first world to running a combat encounter. This is obviously a lot of information here, so please feel free to use the extensive timestamps down below to revisit the sections that are most important to you as you're setting up for your games. I hope that you've also seen that Foundry is capable of a lot of things without having to get into modules and without having to spend a ton of time in terms of learning the system. You can always add more to it as you go, so please check out our other Foundry Basics videos for more information, and our module showcase videos for information on those special modules. Let us know if you have any lingering questions or what you'd like to see us tackle next. Thanks again for watching, happy gaming, and have a good one.